Hey, everybody. Before we get started, I want to thank my friends at Hatch for producing this episode. You can get unlimited podcast editing and strategy for one flat rate by visiting hatch.fm. All right, let's get into the show. Welcome to Distribution First, the show where we flip content marketing on its head and focus on what happens after you hit publish. Each week, I share playbooks, motivations, stories, and strategies to help you repurpose and distribute your content because you deserve to get the most out of everything you create.
So we are joined today by a luminary in the content strategy universe, Justin Simon. How you doing, Justin?
Awesome, Koka. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Well, Justin isn't just a strategist. He's a master at molding pieces of content together and championing a concept that I want to dig into in a little bit called the 3C content repurposing strategy. You are a host of your own podcast. Is that right? The Distribution First show?
Yep.
And you spend your days and probably most of your nights thinking and talking about and executing on these strategies. So let's dive in. Give our listeners a quick overview of what your philosophy is on what content repurposing is in the larger ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, for me, content repurposing, it can be both broad and very specific. For me, I think of content repurposing in two different worlds. I call that micro and macro repurposing. So you think macro repurposing, for me, that's ideas. That's core concepts. That's frameworks. That's, you mentioned the 3C content method. Every company has these things that they want to talk about. Macro repurposing is making sure you're getting those ideas out in multiple ways, in multiple formats. Micro repurposing is what everybody thinks of when they actually think of repurposing, which is like, how do I take this podcast, put it up into clips? And how do I take this newsletter and turn it into LinkedIn content? And, the real tactical nitty gritty. And what I found is you really need to have both worlds happening to make an effective strategy run, because a lot of times if the stuff at the top isn't good, the stuff at the bottom won't be good either.
Does the 3C kind of strategy fit within both the macro and the micro more than the other, or is it kind of how the strategy was defined within those two frameworks?
Yeah, it filters through. I would say in order to make the 3C content method work, which for anybody listening who isn't familiar, it's basically just like cornerstone, core, and cut content. And you're just building a little bit of an engine around these three different types of content models. If you search it or look it up on LinkedIn, I've got lots of stuff for it. But so for instance, if you're going to have a podcast, you need to know ahead of time all the background information, all the reasons for the show, all of those core messages, the core points of view that you want to have. You're building a community, same thing. What are these things that we need to filter throughout everything we're doing? That's more of that. If there's a framework you're teaching, if there, on any of those type of things, you want to be able to have this thing kind of flow through all your content. And unless you have that stuff aligned, you could do micro repurposing until you're blue in the face, but your message is going to be scattered. People aren't going to understand quite what you do. I thought you talked about this and now you're talking about that. Wait a second. How does this tie into that down here? So I think like taking that high level view, most people want to skip right to the tactics. Even the companies I work with, I had a conversation with a client a couple of weeks ago and she was just like, we want to skip right to the fun stuff, we want to skip to like the creating and the,
don't we all,
and which is, it's so tempting, but I think like you have to have that brick foundation of what are we selling? How is what we're selling tie into what we're talking about? How is what we're talking about tie into our main points of view and what's our take on it in this market? And so those are the things when I think about macro repurposing that you really want to think about is like, for me, I have 4 core pillars that I talk about throughout all my content. If I were to discuss them and you followed me for any given amount of time, you'd be like, yep, that sounds pretty close. And then for each one of those, I break out like what's my strongest point of view within those core themes. And then from there, I can then the content becomes whatever. I could write blog posts on that content. I could create podcasts around that content. I could do webinars. I could do the content itself doesn't actually matter as much as you understanding what you're going to talk about, why the audience cares, how it's helping the audience. And then you can format it however you want.
Very interesting. So how do you identify what content's going to be like the prime candidate for this repurposing? Is that thought out ahead of time, or is that discovered in the brainstorming kind of process of what the campaign's going to look like? Or do you start with that in the beginning?
So I think It depends on every company is different. Every person is different. But I would say for me, I'm always trying to, like, if you took the 3C content method with core content, I'm trying to create something that is evergreen and something that is repeatable. And I can create an engine, a repurposing engine off of that first. So for me, that's my podcast. I do the podcast every single week. I know that's consistent. And then I can spin off a consistent repurposing engine off of that. For a client I was just working with, it was a monthly event. So again, it doesn't have to, consistent can be whatever, but now you can then build the repurposing engine off of that. And so in that instance, we built a repurposing engine off of their monthly event to where they can still get content in front of their audience, distribute it, have their key messages, but they don't have to create a podcast every single week because it's a lot of work. They can just do a monthly event, bring people in, learn, adjust, and go from there. So for me, I want to have this engine of something that I can always have running so that I always have content getting distributed. I always have points of view getting distributed. I always have helpful content being distributed. And then that frees me up to, once that engine is running, I don't have to constantly be thinking about, what do I create? What topic should I do? What am I doing a webinar this month, or am I doing that? I don't have to think about that. And then I can think about, if I do want to do specific things, like, maybe in Q2, I will do a couple live events. That's something new, but I can free myself up to do that because I'm not stuck on a hamster wheel trying to create 14 blogs and trying to tie it all together because I've already built that engine up.
Got it. All right. So you've got an interesting background. So for the listeners, it looks like you started off in journalism in some degree, and then you moved into the corporate space, which a lot of like these journalists and writers will end up doing. And you had a nice stint, I think it was Metadata. Is that what the name of the company was? At what point in this kind of trajectory of your career did the 3C concept anchor itself into you? Because at some point, I'm guessing at some point you're like, here it is, like I unlocked.
Yeah, I think it was when I was at Metadata, because I went from, so before Metadata, I worked at a company called TechSmith, SaaS company, software company, but not high growth startup. It was, built in the late 80s and was a 30-year-old company at the time. And so I had a content team that I was managing that was 10 people. And then I went to a high growth startup and I was content team of 1. And so I was stuck to figure out, like, okay, how do we still generate demand and capture demand and do all these things? But I'm just one person and I got a couple of freelancers that are helping me out. And so that's when the idea of the 3C content method, being able to plan these things out, being very strategic and targeted with what we were doing with a purpose, not to say everything lands, because of course everything we do doesn't land, but at least gives you a higher percentage of landing. And so for me, that's when it played out, because we had a massive event that we did. It was demand, and we were, trying to get 10,000 plus people to this event, and spent tons of time and money and effort to drive people to the event. And then afterward, we actually created an engine off of that event that pushed that content out for another 4 or 5 months. And that freed me up to be able to actually start a podcast at Metadata and work on an original research report at Metadata and do some other things, because we had a repurposing engine built out. So that's where the idea of all that stuff sort of really formulated was, all right, if we do one thing a quarter, or if we do 2 really big things a quarter, and we chop this up into other pieces of content, and then chop that up into other pieces of content, and the message at the top is right, then I can guarantee that the message at the bottom is right as well. And that frees me up to be able to do other things, product releases, product launches, stuff comes up all the time.
Other fun stuff as well. Yeah. So, your framework, I mentioned this earlier, like I'm just fascinated with kind of how your trajectory and how you think this through. Like in my mind, like I always think of it as rocks or wood to some degree in building a house. You can start with a boulder, which is like your anchor piece of content, and you can chip away at that boulder and make smaller pieces, social updates, blog posts, whatever it may be. And then from those scattered pieces, you could walk around and just grab that piece and then plug it together and actually build something new from it. To your point, if it's that anchor piece, the message is correct and everything's dialed in there, it doesn't matter the puzzle pieces you put together. You'll just make a different picture with the same message in many ways. It's kind of how I'm hearing you talk about it as well.
Yeah, it's when you have it right and you have it running, it's tough to create something that's wrong. It might not nail, like it might not hit. Like there's lots of content I create that isn't a hit necessarily, but it's not.
But it's on brand.
I was gonna say it's also not wrong, and it's always on brand, and it's always on topic, and it's always hitting on things that the audience cares about. Because again, I put the forethought into the topics I have on the podcast, the people I bring on, the things we talk about. And sometimes I do test and, you're just like, I'm going to just try this over here for a little bit and see what the reaction is. And because, you got to adjust and grow and test. But I think for the most part, it allows you to really frees me up to be like, oh, okay, I know when I go to post on social, it's going to hit. I know when I then take what I'm learning on social and write a newsletter, I know it's going to hit because those same people who are on social are on the email list or people who are like them. And that's they validated that topic and showed me that they're interested in it.
Is that a part of your strategy as well, the testing on social before you pull it into something bigger? Can you talk through that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I literally just wrote the newsletter that's going out. Obviously, folks who are listening to this won't get that newsletter, but I'm writing about it for this week's newsletter. Is just that topic where being able to validate your ideas on social. And again, there's nuance to all this and how much you take on it. But the typical B2B marketer, the plan was everything gets solved with a blog post. And so if we have regardless of what that is. So if I've got a CEO who has a thought leadership thing that they want to get out, we're going to write a blog post about it. If we want to do bottom of funnel conversion piece, we're going to do a blog post about it. If we're going to do something else, we're going to do a blog post about it. That's all fine, but you have to understand how that's going to work and what the resonances are there. And especially at top of funnel content, like points of view, opinions, shifting marketplaces, all that type of stuff. Nobody's searching for that content. So you putting it on your blog isn't really helpful. You have to get that out in front of your audience consistently. And so what I tend to do is, like, let's say I'm doing a webinar. I actually have this planned out for next week. There's a webinar I'm planning out. I'm going to outline that webinar. I'm going to take the main points. I'm going to add a hook. I'm going to take the outline, and then I'm going to edit a little bit. And that's going to be a LinkedIn post. And I'm going to see how it lands, right? Like, is this useful, helpful information that people are curious about? If yes, that's validation to go all in on that webinar. If not, maybe we got to pivot and adjust and figure out what we're going to do. But what I'm not going to do is go out there and spend a week building out a giant webinar trying to get people in and not being sure that people are interested in that topic.
As a marketer, one of the most important things I've learned is that you cannot succeed in a silo. Even as a solopreneur, I needed other marketers in my circle for accountability, support, and growth, and this is why I started the Distribution First community. It's a place to connect with like-minded marketers to follow a proven roadmap that gets you off the content hamster wheel and gets you the exact support you need to maximize your marketing without burning out. For more information, just go to distributionfirst.club.
And then I guess that then brings in this idea of your audience collecting feedback and ultimately building a community. So I know that you're building your own as well. Like, you have a community of all your followers and your fans, and you have your podcast, but you're also helping your clients do this as well. Like, it seems to me, like, based off of what you just said, your content machine and your philosophy really just comes down to how are you engaging with this audience and building a community based off of content.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to, I was thinking about this a little bit earlier when I was driving around town, and it just came to me where a lot of companies they're so internally focused, and there's external reasons for that, especially in B2B SaaS with funding and all those things. And a lot of companies play quarter to quarter, and it's really hard to build something sustainable and connect with an audience when you're trying to just get them to do something. It's very transactional, but I think it's going to be really hard to build successful companies doing that. And so it's this weird dichotomy within businesses. But for me, I built it up to where it's like, I'm just going to try to provide as much helpful value for free on LinkedIn, email, podcasts. I'm going to give away everything that I have for free. And then eventually you may want help with something, and I'm there to help you if you need it. It's really just, I think the more people can give away, regardless of what it is, the more that's going to help them in the long run. It has never served me poorly to give away information and to hop on calls and to provide value. I mean, there's been numerous people where I've just hopped on a free call, given them a half hour's worth of my time, and then they turn around 2 months later and become a coaching client. Like, it's just,
yeah.
And there was no reason for that. It was just, hey, I'll help you out here. So,
yeah, I have my own kind of methodologies, I guess, in life. And the very first one is visibility creates opportunity. And the core tenet of that is that you have to become omnipresent. And so it doesn't matter if you have the cure for cancer, so to speak. If nobody knows you exist, Nobody's taken it. And then, so how do you become omnipresent so that these buyers, no matter where they turn, could be email, their social, wherever they are, they're seeing your name, so that when the problem does rise, they immediately think, oh, I need content repurposing. That's a Justin guy. Like, I see him everywhere talking about the effects of this. Like, it's like, that seems to be kind of your approach to this. And then, one of the other core tenets, and again, like, I'm just fascinated with this conversation with you, is adding value in excess. And what I mean by that is, when I was in sales, this was kind of my mantra. And then I moved it into marketing. Like, nobody was going to take a meeting with me as a salesperson unless there was some value exchange. And so my philosophy was, in order for somebody to give me a half an hour of time, they had to believe that they had already gotten like a week's worth of value from me in some general form to even get on that call. So it was a no-brainer to get on the phone with me. They're like, holy shit, I want to talk to that guy. So adding value in excess as a creator, as Justin, and what you're also teaching your clients is just put it all out there. Be omnipresent so that when somebody has a question or somebody has a problem, you're the first name that's going to pop up into their head because you put it all out there. And so they're not going to be able to decode most of it. They're just going to know that, oh, this is the right person in most cases, right?
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think omnipresent too is like, that's overwhelming. Just speaking to the folks that I work with, that's overwhelming for a lot of folks. But this is the interesting thing. You don't have to be omnipresent to feel omnipresent. So for example, right, like my distribution channels are email and LinkedIn in a podcast feed. I don't do YouTube. I don't do shorts. I don't do Instagram. I don't do X. I don't do Facebook. I do LinkedIn and email. And the funny thing is I can still hop on calls and have people, as soon as I hop on the call, I'll be like, you're just a machine. I see your stuff everywhere. How are you doing it? And then like, I'm getting an email and then I'm getting this and I'm getting that. I'm like, do you know I send like 2 emails a week and post 5 days a week on LinkedIn, and that's it? Like, it's not as if I am building a system to where I'm having to create hundreds of pieces of content in any given week. And I think that's the unlock for people. But the key with that's where it comes back down to like really nailing the audience, nailing what content you're doing, being a servant, being able to, provide value for folks, is because I'm not wasting any reps. I'm not, trying to show up on LinkedIn and just post something to post something. I'm not going to AI and just like, give me a repurposing thing, and help me create a post about it. I'm trying to create value and do it in a consistent way. And I think that's the key, is like, if you did 2 channels, but you did them consistently for a year, 90% of people are going to not do that. They're not going to be able to do it. They can't sustain. And so I think that's the funny thing. Everybody says it. I feel like I'm living reality of this. Just outlasting other folks is a key lever for you.
Yeah, I feel like outlasting people is really just removing. It's like people get motivated to become influencers, or motivated into a space to be a voice in a space. I don't want to use the term influencer lightly, but they get motivated, and there's an emotional attachment to it, and eventually those emotions wane out. And if you're not convinced that this is the right approach, you're going to find the next thing and you're going to move on. And the real successful people I've seen in my entire career, like, I feel like I hit a pinnacle when I was at LinkedIn for a number of years. I was the guy, but I was always trying to stay humble in that process, because I saw the people around me that were taking it for granted, and just watching how everything kind of fell apart for them because they didn't really believe what they were saying. They were just riding that train, so to speak. And I think you see that across every industry.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing with that, like being consistent and persistent, a core tenet for me is being willing and able to repeat yourself, being comfortable repeating yourself. So for instance, the 3C content method, that has been around in my brain for at least the last 3 or 4 years. I post about it on LinkedIn and write email content and do podcasts about it probably once, twice a quarter. And I feel comfortable doing that because every time I do it, there's a whole slew of new people who had never heard of it or thought of it or argue with me about it, which is always fun. It's the internet. So that happens. But I think being comfortable repeating yourself, knowing like, just because everybody saw it once, they're not going to hate you. They're not going to be, Johnny's talking about this again. I can't believe it. Or really the 3C method again. I always tell people, if you look at anybody who's been successful, there are people, professional speakers, etc., who talked about one thing in 1989 and are still telling the same story today. Not because they have to, but because it's still works and it's relevant and it makes sense. Why not?
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of individuals get bored with that and they move on.
Companies too. I think it's a huge thing. Like just from a company, CEO down, why are we talking about this again? What's the new thing we're going to talk about in Q2?
Right. So we talked about a lot about the creation process, but one of the things you really do talk about a lot is distribution first and what that looks like. So you have a machine, you have an entire process, but how does distribution first then collapse into that process of creating this content?
Distribution first really ties into kind of what we talked about with understanding your channels, your points of view, and where you want to be before you even start creating. Because what that's going to do is going to frame out how much content you even need to create. Most people are creating way too much content or creating so much content they can't even distribute it all or get it out there. And so it sits on a blog archive somewhere and just does nothing. For me, it's like I want to be so strategic with what I'm creating. I don't want to create anything more than I have to, because then what I'm not doing, like I like creating content, but I also like ditching out early on a Friday and going and hanging out, with my kids or going and play golf. Like I want to be able to like give myself that margin to be like, I don't have to be constantly grinding, creating content. And that's what leads to a lot of creators, a lot of solopreneurs, a lot of B2B marketers to burn out, is they just never feel like they get ahead because they're constantly creating and on to the next thing. And so distribution first is like aligning that to the content creation process to build it in. So for instance, if we're creating a blog plan for the quarter, I want to, and really before we even get to the blog plan, it's where are we sharing content in February, March, April, May, June, July? Where are we sharing content? Well, we're sharing it on email and we're sharing it on LinkedIn. All right. So if you do LinkedIn 5 days a week, you only have 20 slots in a month. So what are you filling those 20 slots with? And that's when you can start to think about your POVs. That's when you can start to think about, so like your themes. So for me, it's like, all right, I want to make sure I'm hitting these 4 themes. I want to make sure I'm hitting these POVs under it. What content mix do I now need to create in order to distribute that and get that stuff out there? That's where distribution first comes in.
Awesome. I like that as well. You touched on it, and I wanted to talk to you about this. And with the time that we have left, is the last year, the year and a half, really has been impactful. I guess is a minor way of saying how AI is impacting marketing, specifically into the content space and the repurposing space. Like, for example, I'm not a video editor, but I love the fact that there are AI tools out there that I can drop in a full-length video and it'll give me the clips, and the clips aren't bad. Like it knows where the inflection points are in a conversation to pull that stuff out. We're seeing it within the written copy side of things. I think there's a lot to be wanted on that side of it, but it works. And I built my own systems here within the Startup Marketer because I am a marketer of one and I need to create tons of content and I can't write it all myself. So I've built bots in many ways to create the stuff for me. There's a human editing layer through it. But how do you think through that, and how do you see your clients, and how do you talk to your clients about the AI space and where that fits in?
So I can speak for me and how I'm the same way. I use it every day, all day for many, many things. And it has sped up my business incredibly to where I can start new initiatives. I can do audience research. I can ask questions. I can do so many things beyond just creating content. Obviously, it's helpful for that as well. But I think it's all the nitty gritty things underneath creating content that it's really, really helpful for. Like you said, I think it's all, and then it takes the human touch and the human editing. I actually just had a conversation with Ross Simmons, who's also huge in the repurposing distribution space, on my podcast, all about AI. He has a whole AI console that he talks about and how to use it for marketers. So if you're interested in learning more about AI and how that works, go check out the distribution first feed. But how I'm advising clients, it kind of depends on how comfortable they are. Some clients, they're so scared of it in terms of penalties or in terms of plagiarism or in terms of just like, this feels like something we shouldn't be using. Other companies, it can be a crutch for, this is how we create content, or like, can't we just like punch something in here and turn this blog post or this podcast into like tons of LinkedIn content? And you're like, have you read that LinkedIn content? Like, it's not that good. And so I think it flows both ways. But for me, I think the marketers who use AI are going to be the ones running marketing teams, running their own thing, surviving over the next decade. The ones who don't are not going to. To me, it feels as big, probably honestly bigger than when social media came out, and at that time it was like, do we really need to be on Twitter or our company? Like, what are we doing here? Do we need to, and it's like now, how do you function without, doing social media in some way, shape or form? And so that's kind of the level at which I see AI taking over for marketing.
Yeah. 10 years ago, I'm going to be dating myself. Maybe it was longer than 10 years ago. The social selling concept, getting salespeople to leverage LinkedIn to connect with their buyers. As I was kind of at the forefront, kind of evangelizing that concept, I was faced with the same skepticism going into companies where they're like, I don't want my sales team on LinkedIn because then they're just going to find new jobs, or they're just going to be talking about things that we don't want them talking about. And it's like, well, no, it's all education, and you can't be afraid of it, because I had a very similar belief as you do about AI. That if you don't adopt this, you're going to be irrelevant. And, salespeople who failed to adopt LinkedIn 10 years ago because, they didn't think it was relevant, like the younger generation was all on board with it. They slowly went away because they couldn't keep up with all the other conversations and the connections because the entire world changed. COVID really put an emphasis on some of this stuff because of travel restrictions and things. Mm-hmm. But the individuals who knew how to use social from a sales standpoint well outperformed all the salespeople who didn't during that time in life. And I think when AI started becoming a thing, I almost had this weird epiphany. Like, it's the same thing. Like, if you don't figure out how to use this, you can't be afraid of it. And lots of marketers are afraid of it. But I'm like, you have to figure it out. You have to see where it fits into your workflow just to make you faster. If nothing else, you don't need to become a guru at it, but just what are the little processes that it's going to help speed up for you? And I think that's the way to do it.
And it's interesting because when I was talking to Ross about this, it was really, he's so far into it in a lot of ways. And he was saying, don't be afraid of it, but also like use it as a mentor. He brought up an example that blew my mind. You're talking about sales, and I obviously have sales calls now with clients and potential clients and things like that. And he's like, you can have that AI act as an expert salesperson and give you feedback on what you could do better in your next sales call. It's like just stuff like that, where it's like, use it as a mentor, use it as, you don't just have to use it as an assistant. You can, that's super helpful, but you can use it for an expertise that you don't have.
I used it for market research in some ways. Like, I've built little systems where I have a product for a client, company, whatever it is. I'll say, here it is. Here's the value props. Here's the product. Now create me 5 personas based on whatever geography, whatever it is, and tell me about these people. And it tells me who these people are. And I'm like, now based off of these people, evaluate this product with their belief system. And like, you get, like, it's not as good as having them in the room, but it is an amazing substitute for it because it gets into the behavioral aspects because it has all the knowledge. And if you can ask, it all really comes down, like my parents used to tell me, it's all in the questions that you ask and how you ask the question. Because you ask a bad question, you're going to get a bad answer. But if the more specific you can get, the better it will perform. And I see that same thing with content that it produces.
Yeah, I'm with you there, man.
So I appreciate this. There are some rapid fire questions that we like to just ask every guest. And so we'll run through those really quick. What excites you the most about the startup space versus the enterprise? Because you work with a lot of startups, I'm guessing.
I would just say the agility at which things can happen. Startup world, things can move much faster. There's usually less red tape. There's usually less corporate overlords trying to control different layers of the company. There's also smaller teams, which just naturally makes things move faster too. Like, I found for me, working with smaller teams is much more beneficial than working with super large teams. Because me coming in and trying to help teams who are large, there's just more conversations that need to happen, more historical background, stuff like that. So I think in terms of startup versus enterprise, that would be the agility and speed at which things can get done is super exciting. I think sometimes enterprise, I compare to like trying to turn the Titanic around. Like, it's possible, but it's going to take a long time.
Yeah. What's something you know now that you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Man, so many things. If we stick with content,
yes.
If we stick with content, I think you don't need to create nearly as much content as you think. You can create a pretty sustainable funnel with probably less than 20 pieces of content.
Interesting. Nice. Okay. What is your favorite Chrome extension?
Oh, Undistracted, I think it's called. You can block YouTube and LinkedIn and X feeds and all that stuff. And because I get distracted. And so I can just, with a click of a button, I can block email, Gmail, all the social channels, and then I can focus. And, if I try to type that in, it just redirects to a blank.
Oh, it blocks the actual domain, not just,
yes.
It doesn't just suspend it in your feed or notifications.
Yes. Yeah. No, it gives you a whole host of things you can adjust and change on it. Like for me, I hide the LinkedIn feed. So if I go, I want to check because I'll end up scrolling, and then I've lost 25 minutes of my life, and it take me 25 minutes to get back. And so,
and you just wanted to check an in-mail the next.
I just want to check my messages and things like that. And so, I block that, and then it helps me get more deep work done.
What startup do you think is excelling in marketing when you look at the landscape? Which companies kind of jump out at you?
My favorite company right now is LetterDrop. They're so small, and they are crushing it with employee advocacy, with their CEO who has a strong point of view, with just how they're doing marketing. Yeah, I'm super, super bullish on what they're doing. I've talked with Parthy, their CEO, a couple of times, and I think the way they're thinking about marketing is really, really interesting. And then they're executing on it in a really interesting way too, and trying to make sure that what they're doing ties back to revenue ultimately, and they're not just doing things to do things.
Yeah, lots of companies just do things to do things. Awesome. Well, Justin, I said we could probably talk for 2 hours, and I've already used up too much of your time. Thank you so much for being a guest. Where can the listeners find you online? I think you said you're basically on LinkedIn and email. So what's your domain?
Yeah, my website's justinsimon.co. If you actually go to justinsimon.co or justinsimon.co/remix, it'll walk you through. I've got a free guide that'll walk you through how to repurpose blog content and get started doing that. So if you are like, we've got a bunch of stuff, where do we start with this whole repurposing thing? That's a great resource. And then I'm also, if you want to check out the podcast, that's distributionfirst.co, and then TBD, but soon is coming a membership on my end too, where folks are going to come in and jam on all things distribution and repurposing. So that's coming soon.
Outstanding. It's a fascinating journey. Great conversation. I had 20 more questions I wanted to ask you. Anything else for the listeners before we go? Any closing thoughts on your side?
I mean, on my side, I think it's just give yourself time to take a step back and question what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're doing. Ask, do you really need to create this much stuff? Really put a microscope and a magnifying glass on your overall strategy. And I bet you'll find spots where you can remove things and free up more time than you think you have.
Awesome. Well, Justin, thank you so much for being a guest on today's podcast. And again, I will say this, follow Justin, sign up for his emails. His email threads that come through to me were the things that actually drew me into wanting to have this conversation, because I think you've nailed it. How you think about content and how you're using your own best practices. It was amazing to me to see how you were basically using the same processes that you were talking about. And it was obvious to me. And I was like, oh, he knows how this will how to work. So thank you so much for having the conversation with us today.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Distribution First, and thank you for listening all the way through. I appreciate you so much. And I hope you're able to apply what you learned in this episode one way or another into your content strategy as well. Speaking of strategy, we have a lot of things going on this year that are going to help you build your brand, 10x your content, and transform the way you do content marketing. Make sure to subscribe to the show and sign up for my newsletter at justinsimon.co so you don't miss a thing. I look forward to serving you in the next episode as well. And until then, take care, and I'll see you next time.